That looks good. All set, Janice?
Yep, you are good. You guys should be live.
Wonderful. Well, welcome and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. For anyone who doesn't know me yet, my name's Maggie. I'm a scientist at FP Environmental, and I'm working with the Megunticook River Citizens Advisory Committee with their charge to engage the community in exploring different resiliency outcomes for the Megunticook River. I'm joined by my colleague Mindy, who's on screen today. So this is our 5th presentation in this monthly series. Thank you to those of you who have attended multiple presentations. They're all held virtually on the 3rd Tuesday of the month. And our hope is that each of the presentation can focus on a different aspect of the river that can help both the committee and the public better understand future management options on the river. So today I'd like to welcome Dr. Darren Ranco. He will be giving our talk on Wabanaki land relations, caretaking, and responsibility, and specifically thoughts on the Megunticook River. Dr. Ranco is a citizen of the Penobscot Nation, a professor of anthropology, and chair of the Native American programs, and as well as a faculty fellow at the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions at the University of Maine. And he has a Master's of Studies in Environmental Law from Vermont Law School and a PhD in Social Anthropology from Harvard. And his research focuses on ways in which Indigenous nations resist environmental destruction by using Indigenous science and diplomacies to protect their natural and cultural resources. So Dr. Ranco teaches classes on Indigenous intellectual property rights, research ethics, environmental justice, and tribal governance. As a citizen of the Penobscot Nation, he's particularly interested in how better research relationships can be made between universities, land trusts, Native and non-Native researchers, as well as Indigenous communities. So we are absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Ranco here. I highly recommend you explore some of his really interesting publications as well. So we will begin with a 20 to 30 minute presentation by Dr. Ranco, and then there'll be an opportunity for question and answers. Just as a reminder for anyone new joining us today, all the questions from the committee and the public should be submitted through the Q&A feature, and I'll moderate those questions. We will keep the complete presentation to an hour, so I will end it at exactly 5:30, and it is live streamed on the town YouTube page, so it will remain posted if you want to go back and watch it or share it with any of your friends. So before I turn it over to Dr. Ranco, I just want to introduce the names of each of our committee members. It's a 9-person committee guiding the town and making these decisions on restoration options on the river. So our committee is Ray Andresen, Courtney Cease, Deb Chapman, Elfie Owen, Ellen Reynolds, Tyler Smith, Seth Taylor, Rick Thackeray, and Susan Todd. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Ranco. Thank you again so much for being here.
Thanks, Maggie, and it's a really kind introduction. I actually have my mom introduce me that way as well, so that's really helpful. Really huge thanks to the Megunticook River Citizens Advisory Committee to engage me in this in the work they're doing, to have Indigenous folks come in and engage in this work. I think it's really important, and it shows just it says a lot of good things about this advisory committee and the seriousness with which you all are doing this work. So, and I apologize, as a PhD and doing PowerPoints and everything like that, is going to be, I'm going to try to keep it as short as possible, but there's so much to say. So
I feel like asking people to do 20-minute presentation is sometimes like the hardest request we make.
It's okay. I've been around. Okay. So yeah, I want to just say again, thanks to everyone, and this is work that's really occupying my thoughts in a heavy way right now. So really working on the ideas of our collective responsibility and caretaking roles as Wabanaki people to places across our territory has really been a foundational to what I'm doing. And actually, I'm going on sabbatical to work on this even more next year. So hopefully I can re-engage you guys a little bit next year. So in my short time with you, I want to explore a little bit about the opportunities for Indigenous-led conservation, look about the cultural frames of this work, which is land back and rematriation efforts, show kind of key pieces of evidence related to Indigenous-centered conservation. I'll give that particular short shrift for today, and think about best practices for establishing Indigenous-led conservation work, and sort of partnerships for that might help dictate where you all bring this work as well at along the Megunticook. Just FYI for people, I'm sure everyone knows where our tribes are located. And actually, I should change the slide. The Rustic Band of Micmacs is now known as Micmac Nation. These are the seats of government for our tribes. This is actually where our current land holdings are. Again, you know, you can see with Penobscot and Passamaquoddy, the larger land holdings. And the majority of these lands returned and repurchased actually through a settlement from 1980, but with also retained reservation lands for both those tribes, as well as return lands and with the Holden Band of Maliseets and Micmac Nation. But also, when Wabanaki people think about our place on this land, we consider this the Jawabanagik, the broader traditional territory, and our connections to the communities across this territory as our homeland. So the border and the state of Maine aren't as critical to our sort of collective imaginary of what makes us sort of broadly Wabanaki, which is a confederacy and a cultural set of interconnections based on kinship and diplomacy and other things. One of the things that, you know, I'm entering into your space is seeing that this is sort of one of the places, your river and watershed and places up and along the mid coast, places that are protected and aren't protected, conserved lands, parklands. But for us in our recent 5 years around engaging with land groups and caretaker organizations like your own, is to really think about what are these challenges and opportunities related to where your land bases are and where our lands continue to be held, and sort of who has what responsibility to them. I will say this, that the formation of our settlement, the Settlement Act in 1980, had to do with lands in the gray area. Sorry, this isn't the best map in the world, but basically any of the shaded areas were lands taken or seized or handed over to the state of Massachusetts first, and then the state of Maine, with treaties that were in violation of federal law after 1790. So that broader place of where this work is happening and connecting it to our places. I did want to give a little bit of a shout out to my tribe, the Penobscot Nation Cultural Historic Preservation Department work that we've been doing around place names and our connection to places across our landscape and our territory is a really important part of this work. I strongly encourage you, if this is of interest, encourage you to have James Francis and our language speakers, Carol Dana, Gabe Paul, and others involved in making this map to come down and also present, because I think there's a lot more than what I'm going to share. There's just a couple of screenshots from this map just to center us a little bit on the Megunticook area. The place, it's so hard to isolate places, but you know, the place around the Megunticook and across, especially across the bay there, these are majorly important cultural places to Penobscot people. And you see this orientation around a moose out in the bay there. there's a really important story about a moose calf being chased and across this landscape, and how it marks this landscape for future generations and our current generations, and really helps us navigate across this landscape to our homeland upriver in the Penobscot River. And it's a really important story in sort of our place along this landscape, as well as our responsibilities. So while the areas around the Megunticook are, of course, the translation of the river is sort of being big mountain harbor, and I think that's pretty obvious for why that's the case. But the other places are, places of caretaking. At the patch of rough land where you see that location there, just above the river, and I think that's people who are familiar with that place can sort of attest to some of the roughness of that land, as well as sort of these other indicators around choppy seas and at this gravel bar area, which of course I was going to lose where that was, but across the way there. So for a lot of the frameworks of Penobscot place names relates to out here in the Bay, obviously, but connecting that to lands and locations along the Big Mountain Harbor and the river itself. So when I think about, and there's a huge deep cultural history I have no time to really go into, when I think about what is now happening across this landscape, though, I want to describe two interrelated things that we as Indigenous people are engaging in. One is referred to as rematriation work, and the other is referred to as land back, but they're critically important for one another. And when I think about what this is about. So rematriation and land back are both about centering the right relationships between humans and non-humans. Land back is a much more explicitly political movement. It's also a culture as well, but it really emphasizes and takes on the legacy of colonization in very specific ways by emphasizing a return of everything stolen from us as Indigenous peoples, land, language, ceremony, medicines, kinship, etc. Rematriation is a much more self-consciously cultural movement and is really much more related to our caretaking roles as Wabanaki people, that our first treaties are often with non-humans and places across this landscape. So, many of you might have holy lands in somewhere, in the Middle East, across the world. Our holy lands as Wabanaki people are really across this landscape. And while we have been reduced in our land holdings, we are still in our original territory. The rematriation efforts are really about centering women in tradition, not so much men in property. They often are emphasize healing relationships related to food sovereignty, but food sovereignty not just to feed populations, but food sovereignty as a sense of cultural well-being, as well as healing relationships between people, the land, and in some ways our collective history on this land. My friend and fellow Penobscot Nation citizen, Sherry Mitchell, talks a little bit about the role of women in this work, and I think rematriation is not just a turn of phrase to counter repatriation, which is the sort of return of these sort of tangible cultural artifacts to groups or ancestors to groups of people, but to really think about this as women-centered work and caretaking work. She talks about women being at the center of our communities, leading the work to recover our traditional ways of knowing and being through language, renewal of kinship networks, revitalization of land-based teachings, relationships between all systems within creation. Women are decolonizing stories and developing pathways for food sovereignty, protecting our lands and waters, and a huge shift in terms of our diplomacy work has happened because of Wabanaki women's leadership. So often I bring up the idea that our diplomacy and our science is really a part of the key frames around this work. I've been doing one of the projects here in Maine since 2009 has been attempts at protecting our ash tree, the brown ash tree. And because of our work there collectively across the tribes and with many foresters in and outside the government, state, federal, and tribal governments, we've been able to kind of develop a pathway where Indigenous people have a lot more access and control in the response around the emerald ash borer. This means that we've been able to center Indigenous ways of knowing and diplomacy, which is often go together because our knowledge traditions are often tied with the process to actually protect places and engage in those places, that often the knowing of something engenders a responsibility to protect it and to bring it, caretake it for as long as you know about it. And that's and I will say this, like you see a sweetgrass harvesting. This is foundational teaching around sweetgrass is that if we take care of it, it will take care of us, right? So that actually means for us to take care of it, we have to pick it. And the science around that, both from an Indigenous and Western science perspective, is that in fact that those kinds of rhizomatic grasses are actually when they are picked, they return in larger numbers the following year. So that's part of our teachings as well. There's been this shift in the way that conservation groups and land trusts have thought about the connections between land protection and the role of biodiversity in particular across the world. Since this 2008 report, and many of you have probably heard these statistics before, well, Indigenous people make up just 4% of the global population and have roughly 20 to 22% of the world's land surface under some obligation to us, some legal connection to not often owning it, but having access to it. That 20 to 22% of the world's land surface is where 80% of the planet's biodiversity exists. So besides just sort of understanding that in 2008, as perhaps a coincidence, scholarship in the last 25 years, last 15 years, I should say, has really motivated us to understand why is that the case? Well, is it, as we suspect as Indigenous people, because of our caretaking roles and responsibilities and how we engage in management or stewardship? And so I think these are this is what a lot of scholars have been working with, try to understand. I've been a part of this scholarship. There's a 2021 article from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where I was a small part of a team that looked at the way that human beings have shaped most of terrestrial nature for the last 12,000 years. One thing that we found, and this was a part of my role in this work, was that the current biodiversity losses are caused not by sort of first human conversion or degradation of untouched ecosystems, but that they have been, the biodiversity has in fact been impacted greatly by more recent appropriation, colonization, and intensification of use in lands inhabited and used by prior societies. So the prior societies, often in these cases, are Indigenous people, and that for almost 11,500 years, human beings have been a pretty positive influence on biodiversity, even as we developed a large-scale agriculture in the last couple of thousand years. It's been only in these last couple hundred where we've really negatively impacted biodiversity. To me, that's a hopeful story that human beings aren't the problem. It's just sort of the cultures that of proliferation that we've developed in the last couple hundred years. So it's within us to serve biodiversity and non-humans in productive ways. You can go around, there's a lot of scholarship around this, the role of Indigenous peoples and equitable conservation. What you get from a lot of these pieces of scholarship is that by including Indigenous people in leadership and decision-making roles and really engaging in partnership, the best kinds of conservation work is happening around the globe. And this is in a number of countries, in a number of locations, and different scales of this work, but more and more every day in these last couple of years, especially, more work is showing that this is the best approach to land protection, and conservation work is really emphasizing relations with Indigenous people and Indigenous people's authorities in particular. So as well as in supporting Indigenous governance, and that is obviously something that we are struggling with in Maine vis-a-vis our sovereignty and the state of Maine. So I just want to talk a little bit about the possibilities here. What we're doing, the first part of it about 5 or 6 years ago was the formation of a number of us working with the land conservation groups and land trusts to establish what is called the First Light Learning Journey. This was a collaboration between conservation organizations and the Wabanaki Confederacy tribes to rebuild Wabanaki stewardship and presence across our landscape. This is an action by land trusts to educate themselves, but also in recognition of this scholarship that better conservation work is being done in partnership with Indigenous people. And I think in Maine, we have a large number of our conservation and land trust organizations that are aware of this and really wanted to learn how to do this work. And that these collaborations would be about acquiring lands, creating access agreements, co-managing, repatriating, rematriating, all of this work. And so this started as an educational program for land trusts. That quickly led to the creation of the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship, which is a Wabanaki Indigenous-led organization. Here, the mission has been to improve the health and well-being of our people through an effort to expand our access, management, and ownership of lands, to practice our land-based cultures, acquiring land, sharing, co-managing, very similar, but it's from the Wabanaki side as the First Light Learning Journey. We're seeking to create partnership and education, a stronger conservation movement that includes and reflects Wabanaki expertise and perspective. The results, of course, have been just in these last couple of years. The commission itself was seated in just in the last 2 years, but you see 1,500, maybe a little bit more acres of land returned. That number will increase in the next 6 months. Increase Wabanaki access and caretaking roles around to thousands of acres of conservation land trust land. For important cultural items. We're talking about cultural use agreements with various land trusts, and the work is ongoing. There's quite a creative set of possibilities here, including working on the creation of a Wabanaki Self-Determination Fund to help Wabanaki peoples with rematriation work. The first major donation had to do with the Elliottsville Foundation, donating 735 acres of land back to the Penobscot Nation. This, as well as the return of Pine Island to the Passamaquoddy tribe, the videos of these returns of land are on the sunlightmediacollective.org website. So I encourage you all to go and look at these stories and the impacts that these land returns have made on our tribal nations here. With the creation of a new entity like the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship, it creates a really important opportunity for us to work across our tribes, but also to really steward and engage with as many groups as possible. And this is why I appreciate your group inviting me to talk a little bit about the way we do our work with this as well. This is just one example of how, something we share with land trusts and conservation groups. When we think about best practices, this is work from Australia, but to me, this is a really good place to start when I think about organizations wanting to do this work with Indigenous peoples. You can see sort of different ways to make engagements. really sort of require the kinds of partnerships and increase appreciation and application of Indigenous knowledge. Really think about and how to empower and engage Indigenous led Indigenous organizations and decision makers. What are the kinds of committees and representation that you want to bring forward in your work? These are all important questions going forward. To me, and this is just the last slide, like there's so much hope in this work. It's probably the most important thing I can do in my life right now, is to work towards Indigenous access and land responsibility and stewardship and land return. It's very much hard work, and it's about the future generations and the future of our planet. I think both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this area, as well in climate change justice work, are seeing Indigenous leadership as one of the important things that might actually help with ensuring that we will actually have a planet that is inhabitable by humans in the next 100, 200 years. But of course, we face serious challenges, that there are ongoing legacies of colonial structures and exclusions. One thing is real simple that we've discovered is that conservation easements are often so tied to colonial structures that some of the land agreements that we started to work on, the conservation groups or the land trusts would have to have someone out there kind of observing who we are and how we're gathering our traditional plants and medicines, which is really inappropriate. But they have to ensure that we're not harming things that are under conservation easement. So even working through the most fundamental things around access and sort of who we are and how our cultures of care and privacy even function in something like a conservation easement has been a huge challenge. Happy to talk about that more in Q&A. And then really just asking yourself, what are the opportunities, barriers to advance institutional relationships with tribal nations? How do you spend time, build relations, listen, learn, act? I think active listening and learning, and quite honestly, I try to do as many things and represent myself as an active learner in as many situations as I can, and I'm part of the reason why I'm even doing this today. So thank you for your time. I think I kept it to about 25 minutes, so that was a success. I glossed over a bunch of things that I could go into more depth, but really, really happy to be with you all.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, that's wonderful. And let me see here. So Janice, if you're still there, could you promote the committee members to panelists so that they can join us, or you can do that too here? Or Mindy, I don't know if you have. Yeah, okay, that'd be great. Looks like we have a few. Yeah, that was really fantastic. I know I have some questions for anyone that's listening. Please feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A that you'll find on the bottom of your screen, and we can share those with Darren. We have about a half an hour left for discussion. So I think we have one question here that I'm sure a handful of other people are feeling too. So I know, Dr. Renko, when we met to talk about this presentation, you know, your work is really regional, and so the question here is any information how the Wabanaki people currently use or have used the area now occupied by Lake Megunticook and the Megunticook River in Camden Harbor. So I know that you might not know like all the specific histories of that river and lake system, but if you have any like general thoughts on how the river system might have been used or is used, that would, I think, be helpful and interesting.
Yeah, and I there's been more, so I tried to share the place names because that's one of our first sort of engagement there. For me, like looking at the sort of the gravel bar and the choppy seas, this is these are all navigational frameworks, right? So this is obviously a place that is being kind of like warned as unless you're going specifically to this place, it strikes me that people have a history of shellfish harvesting in this area. That's pretty well known, but not exactly, more below this area as you get closer to the like the Owl's Head area. That collection there, in terms of the, that's recognized as a kind of landing place. So if you move further down the map, there's a collection point which actually has, near the Owl's Head, a much more prolific shell fishery and habitation zone. So I think when we look at the Megunticook, it's more of an access point to, I think, with the mountains there. There are particular plants and medicines that only grow at certain heights along the coast. So just in real general, I would see this as a collection point more for particular medicines and plants, and using the Megunticook as an access point to collect those certain things, especially at altitude on the mountains. But I think in terms of significant sort of habitation, you have to go further down, I think a little further down the coast, or go back up towards, the harbor to think about real significant occupation or whatever. So I see this as, just in looking at the place names, I'm feeling like this is a pretty rough area, thinking about it from a Penobscot point of view, from the point of view of as a canoe, and of a canoe. And I think that's where, the work of James Francis, who's the head of the Cultural and Historic Preservation Department, this is a map, an artifact of that ongoing work, and that's sort of how I'm interpreting it, sort of in what I know about the archaeology of the sort of this part of the coast. But the place names are critical because they kind of cut through the orientations. So you have just below, you go down another 30 miles on the coast, then you have place names that are saying like gathering place or landing area. Like that's different than, hey, choppy seas ahead or rough patch of land. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, to us, that's a really important distinction in how we appreciate that. But I think the reference to the mountains in that particular area, just because of our there's so many medicinal plants that are only at altitude in particular. So I'm thinking those are the things that drew people to the area. Obviously, I think the lake makes things more habitable there, but I see just across our cultural landscape as one of for a very specific reason.
And that is something that Camden, it's pretty unique to that area.
Yes.
To have mountains like that right on the coast, and to have those resources close together.
Yeah, and I think that that's the special quality of it. Like, I can see people who are living in those areas, especially below, they're not going to go to Katahdin if the same plant is on top of Bald Mountain or whatever. Like, they're going to go up there, right? They're gonna do that, and they're gonna use the sort of the canoe routes that kind of put you avoiding some of those really rough areas and kind of swing you back up. They might even swing back up around by using the lake with a portage and not wanting to go out into the areas that are sort of choppy seas or rough land areas. So yeah. And James does a great presentation where he talks about just going from that area east of you all up the Penobscot River, from the bay, from where that moose is, right? And it's sort of the different parts of the calf moose that get sort of deposited along that part of Penobscot Bay. He has a whole set of places and place names connected to that story that show how we navigate up from the ocean down there. So please, if that's of interest, it's so interesting. He's so good at it. Please have him in for sure.
Yeah. Well, I know that we've talked about having him in too, so that's good to hear.
Yeah.
I'm hearing that the Q&A might not be working properly, but now I see one came in, so hopefully
Okay.
it's working. But let's see. So I had a question. You know, we work for the work I do, water resource work. We're always talking about thinking across political boundaries and thinking about watershed systems, because the watersheds and water resources don't stick to a specific community. And I was a little curious in the beginning, you talked about, you know, that cross border, and I'm wondering how the Indigenous communities in Maine right now are working with communities in Canada, or like what kind of collaborations are going on.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So you have, I mean, it probably makes sense to you. You have the whole band of Maliseets and the Passamaquoddy tribe probably have the most ongoing collaborations. The whole band of Maliseets have actually been working in an international boundary watershed alliance along the Megunticook for about 20 years. Like they've had a pretty active role in it. You know, I think some of that is about protecting the quality, you know, trying to figure out a way to protect the quality of the Megunticook, which is where their small reservation is right on the banks of the Megunticook in Holton. But really thinking about that broader work, we see this. We're going to have some climate change adaptation workshops coming up with the tribes as well, like you know, really mobilizing across the international boundaries to create opportunities for change. You know, you kind of you have to recognize. I mean, everyone's a realist, of course. Like, you know, only certain things can happen in those international spaces around watershed protection. But I think what Indigenous people in particular can call upon is the fact that, you know, as you know, our tribes are international. There are all these, you know, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, you know, brings us together as caretakers and as potential participants in decision making in a way that even the state of Maine might not have. You know, I think there's a real kind of possibility that we have to shape policy and to bring sort of Indigenous people's issues to the fore. So you see that, and then I think, you know, Donald Saktoma, who's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for Passamaquoddy tribe. I was just with him on Saturday, like, and he's, you know, he's doing work. There's a Passamaquoddy community and what is now New Brunswick, right? But he's kind of the historic preservation officer for both, you know, on both sides of the border. There's a lot of cultural exchange and fisheries work that people are trying to do, even if it's under the guise of separate governments. That the Passamaquoddies though are working, you know, especially around, you know, access points and protection of river herring and all sorts of other things. Like they're taking the real leadership roles in those situations.
Great, thanks. Sophie, do you want to ask a question? Saw your hand up.
If I'm limited to one, it's going to be awful. I have a couple actually. So the first one is, how can we tell the story of the Wabanaki and the other tribes along the river and try to figure out, because I would love to walk along the river and say, so this is where we fish, and this is where we harvest medicinal plants, or this is where we would have settled, whatever. So we weave the story of those First Nations with the river and make it more present in our daily lives. So that's the first question. The second one is, I remember a conversation with one of your colleagues, and I can't remember his name, around, in particular, fish management, and the fact that I think that the Abenakis were particularly interested in working with us on fish management. And I'm wondering if you have documentation of the fish history, because I think for a few of the species of the fishes in the rivers of Maine, we're missing information on whether they were there, or at one point were they there, or when did we fish them. So I'm going to stop here, but I know I could spend an entire day. So these are the few questions on weaving the story and making them present in our lives along the river and fish management.
Yeah, and I think the issue, I mean, I think the fish management issue, so there's a series of historical situations as you go slightly further down. I mean, the Megunticook and a host of some of these streams that go into the ocean from there. Some of them are implicated in colonial histories. So you see, a few of them have like falls or other sort of natural features that are of interest both to indigenous people but also to the colonial forces. So at some point they want to build a fort near the falls, but that's the gathering point for and I was referencing one of those before, that sort of those gathering places. So these, in an interesting way, my colleague Tony Sutton calls these sites that the colonial forces want to build forts on and destroy in their way, as sites of sustenance. And so I think, there are ways to think about, and I would, I understand why you all would want to incorporate our story into your story. Like the bigger question is sort of, why would we want to incorporate our story into your story? I think things like fisheries management and access agreements and things like that, this is what has also shifted this discussion as well, because I think so much of this knowledge is, esoteric from a Western point of view, or, deep, it takes a certain level of traditional knowledge, detective work for archaeology, place names. I think as Indigenous people, we're engaging in that in our homelands and trying to do restoration work of the places that are right near us that we have the ability to access. So the question is, in partnership, how do we collectively share this story with, an entity that isn't as close by, but we want to, that there's a mutually beneficial kind of relationship that can be built there. And I think
I think it's a discussion that's worth having, and we're not going to have it today, but I would love to have it because I understand your point of view. Why would you want to share with us? I know the answer of why I would want to know it, but that's my own personal answer. And as I was typing the question, I'm like, it's a museum approach, right? So it's a museology approach. Here is where they would gather stuff and blah, blah. And at the same time, and that's not what I want to do. My purpose is, this has happened. It's here and now. It's today. It's in our lives. And I feel that we're forgetting that it's here. We're forgetting that the tribes live here the same way we do. So I'm trying to, so I would love to have another conversation on this, on shared, how can we tell the story? How can we help people understand that this is not a thing of the past? It's not Wabanakis don't belong in a museum. So that's right. It's the beginning of a conversation. So maybe this project would be the purpose for that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think, it's not, I'm not saying there's a scenario where just, the way we do our work is that we get a collection, we get a group of people who have different knowledge and from our traditional knowledge carriers and sharers. And we do this work, right? So of areas of concern, it takes, a fair amount of resources, but I think it takes that kind of commitment of like, why are we all doing that? What is each side kind of getting out of this? And sort of what does that mean? I do think the larger work, and this is, I didn't even go into this. There's a whole, land return. There's kind of a land return and a rematriation. There's, things around land. There are also, and you mentioned museums, there's also this shift towards us bringing back the collections of things, right, that have been taken away or lost their way out of our communities, and that we're bringing these back. We're rebuilding language. All of these things is what the land back movement is about. So the idea that we would see, this place as thought of as differently by collectively by everyone, it is something that, you know, Indigenous folks are working on as a reinterpretation to the places. And you can see this happening. And, you know, there's the way that things are shaping up around in the interpretation of the place that is the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. Like there's a whole interpretive framework that is Wabanaki centered. We've never seen anything like that in a place in Maine. Usually it's, you know, it's a story of discoverers, or, you know, Percival Baxter, or even if you go out into, you know, places that are conserved, you know, it's like the great white men who had these ideas about conserving places. You know, you see those examples, but you don't see the indigenous ones. So I think there is this broader urge and work to do reimagine Maine and what is now Maine as a Wabanaki place. And so that I'm not saying that that's unimportant. I just think that it requires a little, you know, there's a little bit more agreement or collection of agreements there.
Maggie, you're muted.
Yeah, Maggie, you're.
Thanks, Mindy. So just to tag on to that, and this kind of addresses a question we have in the Q&A right now, I guess where's the best place to start? Is that reaching out to First Light?
Yeah, I mean, or the Wabanaki Commission, of which I'm a small person on the staff. You know, I think there are, as you can well imagine, like there are sacred places. There are places near reservation lands already. There are, you know, I think there's a prioritization of work. There's a limited bandwidth of people. You know, I think it's all those things kind of enter into this, but there's also the ability to be creative. You know, I think, you know, to use things like pilot projects, you know, to think about the, you know, perhaps the Megunticook, you know, is because of its location, you know, is part of a beginning of something that thinks about the connections across the bay or with even further down the coast. You know, I think, you know, we would see its importance, you know, in a much more broader kind of context. Like I was saying, like it strikes me that the more important places might not be, unfortunately, in terms of when I'm looking at the place names. But, you know, this is all partial knowledge. But I mean, it's like, how do we mobilize the knowledge keepers and sharers to your place, and how do we take that work seriously, and how do we build out from that, you know, which is very clearly, you know, the broader context of you know, it's funny because we, you know, we've worked with land trusts, and they'll be like, I'll get language people there, and I'll get all the you know, some of the people, and be like, oh, it's usually a little closer than you all are to some of where the tribes are at. But they'll be like, well, we have this property. It's been called the X property. I'm not going to say what it is, but we don't like that name anymore. We want to just, can you call this property something else? And we're like, well, it doesn't, you know, our naming, it doesn't map onto like the fact that someone owned this thing and you're referring to that person's family name. Now you want to change it. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like the ask has from it a perspective that isn't even quite, you know, from our perspective as Indigenous people, where we would start, you know, the collectivizing process. So
Yeah, we need to kind of reframe the whole way that we see see it, which okay, well, I know Courtney has some questions, so
right. And we have this whole signage project on our campus too, which is related to, you know, it's like, how do you buildings named after people? I mean, you can't translate that. It doesn't make any sense into our into our language. So
yeah, I'll pass to Courtney because she has, I know, some questions too.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Ranko.
hi.
So our group, we're tasked to give some recommendations for how to restore the river. And I think what would be helpful is to know how the Wabanaki and Penobscot peoples have maybe been involved with projects involving restoration or reconnectivity of rivers? And in what ways have they been involved? And is this an important issue for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I mean, I referenced one of these examples around the international piece with river herring and the Passamaquoddies. That's been an ongoing issue. It's also an ongoing issue because it speaks directly to the idea that we would protect certain kinds of fisheries for sport versus certain kinds of fisheries for natural run, sea run fish, right? So this idea of stocked fish and all that sort of thing. I don't think that's the issue you're specifically referring to. The Penobscot Nation had a really important, and I would say a leadership position in the Penobscot River Restoration Project, which involved the removal of 2 major dams, the reconstruction of some fish passageways, et cetera, et cetera. So there is like some really deep knowledge around what restoration can look like and the decisions around that work. I will say also that the First Light and the Wabanaki Commission work is also engaging in this, like, how to build models that reflect ecological restoration notions and inventories and frameworks that are Wabanaki. So I think there is also this, and this is ongoing, it's just in many ways it's at the beginning of this work, but one of the challenges is, and we look to the Penobscot River Restoration Project and sort of how it's been successful, and it's been hugely successful for a variety of anadromous fish that are returning in the thousands and thousands that hadn't been returning up to the Penobscot for a very long time. But even sort of not every restoration decision or framework thinks about the cultural and ecological histories and ongoing desires equally. So I'm happy to include, we'd be happy to think about this as a case study. We're actually looking at plants. Suzanne Greenlaw, who's a Maliseet citizen and one of my co-advisees at the University of Maine, she's looking at places along the Megunticook around plant work and plant restoration work. And of course, so there are all these ecosystem components, but you have to start someplace, right? In terms of when we're thinking about a healthy, what does the healthy river look like? What are the plants there? What are the animals there? What are the fish there, right? These are all have to be part of this discussion. And I think we're beginning that work in that space in a really interesting way. So I wish I had more to offer you in terms of conclusions or guidance, but it's definitely one of the higher priorities in this next year or two of, as we see more lands being returned to tribal control, the issue of ecological, culturally oriented or based ecological restoration, it becomes a more important discussion, right? Because the return lands have been messed up by settlers, right? So we're trying to think like, and it's new, is the caretaking. I mentioned, sweetgrass is about picking sweetgrass the way we pick it, and that's being helpful to it. But there are all sorts of practices that may or may not, given the deteriorated state of certain ecosystems, maybe our traditional means to restore won't have that kind of impact there. What other techniques can we use to restore places to their more productive, orientation towards biodiversity, that sort of thing.
This is so awesome, Darren. Thank you. So we have this question in the chat that I think you've touched on, like, a lot of these concepts, but do you have any examples or thoughts on kind of incorporating this caretaking into these, like, Western policies and policy making? Like, you were talking about the conservation easements and, like, trying to, like, go on these lands and harvest plants in the ways that you do, but then having people like come by with a checklist and say like, we have to make sure you're not doing harm. So this question I think relates to that, like how do we incorporate that into policy making and also bring policy making to indigenous groups?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big question. I think, so I shared those best practices for certain kinds of organizations at the end. That's one approach to this. I think, the research is showing that governance and the recognition of Indigenous governance is a critical part of this. But it's also not even, it's interesting and when I think about the Wabanaki, or Indigenous positions, even on our own sovereignty, is we often see it as a collective, like win-win opportunity, like that our governance with other people is the ideal type, but we still have to be respected that our governance is important. And I think when I engage with some of the policymakers at the state level, some of them, they presume that it's a zero-sum game, which is to say, if there's more authority and sovereignty for Indigenous people, that means that the state or some other group of people will lose, right? So that there is the zero-sum game is to say that there's only a limited amount of decision making, and then therefore people will lose if they're not the person in power. We see it just so differently culturally in terms of how sovereignty even works, but we're also excluded, right? And we're also told that we shouldn't be trusted with a regulatory authority by certain entities in the state because we might make decisions that will harm the rest of Maine economically. I think that's the position. But we don't see it that it's just not a zero-sum game to us. We see it as a collective action for the will of all. And there are recent studies around Indigenous sovereignty, even in the context of Maine, where we have been left behind, but also rural places in Maine without Wabanaki sovereignty have also been left behind. Like if there would actually be this recognition and deeper set of sort of policymaking frameworks that recognize and enhance Indigenous control and sovereignty, then there would be better outcomes. And that's what the conservation work is saying as well, like that the deeper the decision-making authority and the partnerships, the better the long-term effects around conservation as well. So which is in the history of Maine as well. I mean, it's not that long ago, as far back as the 90s, the 1990s. Many of these land trusts, or some of them, were against a couple of bills that were being put forward in the 1990s that would have enhanced tribal sovereignty around certain decisions in the unorganized territory parts of the state of Maine. And they had their logic was, well, we know how to influence the state's decision-making process, but we don't know how to work with these Indians. So we're going to be against it because we don't know how to influence their political decisions to make the will of our decision-making as a land trust or as a conservation group. Luckily, that has shifted dramatically to see it in a different way. But that was the prevailing logic for some time. So again, zero-sum game.
Yeah, and I imagine, like you had referenced, your capacity to participate in all of these projects can be challenging if you're getting a lot of requests all at once now.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's the idea. I think us organizing as the Wabanaki Commission, I think the idea of streamlining and developing these tools, all of these things are really exciting because it shows some real possibilities. Well,
I appreciate that you started your presentation with a message of hope, because I had looked at your PNAS paper on biodiversity and kind of took the same thing from it when I read it. It's really hopeful. And so does anyone, let's see, it's 5:31. Does anyone have on the screen anything left that they want to add before we close? I think we're probably there. So again, Dr. Engo, thank you so very much for joining us. And I know there are some people on YouTube as well. So if anyone wants to go rewatch, please do. And let's see, so our next presentation will be the third Tuesday of June, which is June 20th from 4:30 to 5:30. And the specifics are yet to be determined, but we're working with the town on a presentation around the current dam maintenance routines and responsibilities. So with that, I will stop the YouTube and have a great evening, everyone. Thanks again.